can hear her. Hit this record button like that, and then it's going to say 2, 1, okay, off we go. So this is Lisa Maroni, and she is taking on the role of Carol Gilligan through the end of theory, and she's going to be talking to us today, or tonight, I guess, about various facets and psychologies of Carol Gilligan. We'll probably have a few other students join us as we go, but I'm not sure where we should start, except I'm going to ask this question to get us started and see where it goes from there, okay? Let's start with a heavy hitter. Some of the students have been wondering, now that we're outside the binary idea of gender and sexual orientation, that isn't it a little simple to describe a male psychology and a female psychology exclusively? It sounds to me like as Gilligan's early work suggests, that there's relationship and justice kinds of principles at work that might be feminine, and masculine might be more principles oriented. How do we understand the fact that there isn't a binary gender identification? Let's just go with that.
That's a great question. I feel like understanding masculine and feminine concepts as different doesn't necessarily mean that all men are masculine and all women are feminine, but it gives you a sense of those differences. Folks who find themselves outside of the binary also have the ability to fall somewhere on that spectrum, but I think in almost every theory, there's a wide spectrum. And so folks can find themselves either more relationship oriented or more justice oriented. If there's a third completely different piece of the theory, I'd love to hear it. There isn't any that's put forth in our field yet, but I'm always interested. Have your students looked at the Kinsey Scale?
No, we have not. But can you say a couple words about that?
So it talks about the differences in if someone is 100% heterosexual versus 100% homosexual, and where they fall on that spectrum. And recently they came up with multiple different pieces within that. So now there's a numbers grid where you can fall within how sex driven you are versus relationship driven, and where you fall on heterosexual versus homosexual. So it's trying to start giving more color and space to folks who might fall outside of what we consider traditional binary sexual orientations. But it's evolving. That only came out less than 5 years ago with those updates. So there's definitely a future and more thought to be had on those theories.
Well, if I could, and let me see if I can ask it this way then too.
I think Ethan is asking something.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Steve.
Sorry, Ethan, what you got?
As soon as the Kinsey Scale was brought up, the first thing I did was open a new tab and Google it. I'm shocked by how short that Wikipedia page is.
You're shocked by what? Can you pull your microphone down, dear?
There's almost no information on the Wikipedia page for that.
Really? Did you find the new one that has the full grid, or are you looking at the old scale that's just the scale model?
It's got numbers from 0 to 6. Each assigned a description, and an X for there isn't anything for that.
Let me see if I can pull up a different link for you and put it in the chat box.
And while you're doing that, let me think too about, you talk about justice orientation and relationship orientation, and as you say that there isn't a binary, it's more of a spectrum as you describe it. Is it also fair to say that justice and relationships are not necessarily two ends of a binary, but that they just happen to be principles that we have? So in other words, I could be really justice oriented, but to a certain degree I might also be relationship oriented, just to a lesser extent. The two of them are not in opposition to each other either.
I think one of the grand challenges of adulthood is finding a balance with those concepts. And so say you're going to fire someone from a job, and that needs to happen as a justice piece. How do you make sure that the relationships are preserved? Do you give that person the ability to say they're going to retire and give them a party and allow them to save face while still enacting that? Or do you fire them and have all the relationship fallout that comes from an adversarial piece rather than a joint agreement of mutual parting? There's ways that you see these concepts modeled in the real world, quote unquote, both in relationships and in the workplace. But different people will fall more to one side or the other, where I want to fire you, I don't care what the relational fallout is, or we might need to part ways, but we want to make sure that the staff is okay once that happens. There's ways that you can honor each of these concepts in the way that you go forward, even if the same action is taken.
So if I think of it in the way you're describing, is it safe to say, no, maybe not safe to say, but is it fair to say that the male who is only focused on justice-oriented behavior is missing a piece, or is blind to themselves to an essential component of who they are as a human? And similarly, with the female who is unable to grasp or understand justice concepts.
Absolutely. I mean, anytime you have someone who cares only about justice and not about people, are going to end up, one, isolating themselves and not being a very pleasant person to be around, which is why sometimes you see high-powered CEOs who have several ex-wives, no children, still talking to them. They might have a lot of money, but they don't have any relational support in their lives. Or if you see women who say, yeah, my kid killed someone, but he shouldn't go to jail because he's my kid,
Right.
That's also not acceptable. And there's clear examples that there needs to be a spectrum within those pieces. Where someone falls, and I guess what the answer of right is not always going to be the same for everyone. But if there isn't some sort of balance, they're going to be out of whack.
Yeah, and out of whack is a nice way of saying potentially, well, like I think you said before, they're not invited to all the best social parties.
Yes.
Okay.
I have a very dear friend that works in university development, and he told me that many of the donors who give to the school are very, very wealthy and have no contact with anyone who would actually want to take money from them. So they give it to charity because they have no one else who is willing to stand their presence. And when you look at the long course of life, that's probably not where you want to end up.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. And I don't know. I mean, I guess, is it therapy then that you might go into to say, well, I'm having issues socializing, so that's a consideration for an adult for therapy? Yes.
Absolutely. And I think especially with social deficits, group therapy is often what's recommended. So you come and there's one or two counselors and a group where you talk about the issues you're having, and both the counselor and the group can weigh in. But the nice thing is it strips away titles and it strips away the status markers people might use to elevate themselves and focuses more on their actual relational skills.
Yeah. That's and Ethan, I'm trying to unmute you and I haven't been able to do it. Sorry about that. I was just the feedback. There you go. You have control over that, don't you?
Yeah, I can always see it, but I don't know why you can only mute me.
Okay, yeah. It's a skill it's a power I kind of admire, actually. But yeah, we're still getting that feedback every now and then from your computer. I don't know why. But anyway, so I it's interesting because when we look at characters, I'm starting to think about literature now. And from an authorial perspective, as a writer, how do I'm just thinking aloud, how might I write a female character genuinely? Because there's a lot of accusations that male writers are unable to write female characters honestly. and perhaps vice versa. But I hear the first accusation more. Is that because they don't understand this gender orientation?
I would hesitate to say that you can't give authentic voice as a male or female writer to someone of any of the other genders. But I think there has been historically a challenge for some men to understand female voices from a relational perspective. And so I think effort has to be made, that women are complex and men are complex. But it's rare that you would look at a woman who's just cutthroat, justice oriented, doesn't care about anyone around her. And if you see a character like that, it's probably not going to be in any of the great novels that you're reading in one of your classes.
Right.
But even as a woman writing from the mind of another woman, I think everybody has limitations when they're able to see an experience based on their life experience and their willingness to press into other experiences. So I would cautiously disagree with the assertion that people can't give voice to other people's stories, but I think best practice is to listen first and have what you've heard inform your characters as opposed to what you've imagined out of thin air.
Right. And there's the Bechdel test, which I hesitate. I didn't want to bring it up, but for people who aren't familiar with the Bechdel test, it's the suggestion that you can't have a female character in a film that can go more than 30 seconds or so without talking about a man in the room or about a relationship with a man or something like that. That apparently female dialogue is.
The test was you have to have two named female characters who speak to each other about something other than a man.
Yeah.
Incredibly hard to pass the Bechdel test, even for works of literature or movies that are written by women.
Say that again.
Which part?
That last part. It's extremely hard to do what exactly?
Even when the work is written by a woman, it's very rare to find a work that actually does pass the Bechdel test.
Which is interesting because if you flipped it and you had men talking, they would have no trouble. Those characters wouldn't have trouble.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yes, there are conversations about women, but the whole gamut of conversations occur there. So that's a slightly different topic than what I imagine we talk about. But it just occurred to me as you were talking, I was thinking of authorial power, why men seem to have such a hard time, if they do, writing this way. And maybe Hollywood film is not the most fair place to have that test. Probably not. There are very few films that seem to do well from a literary perspective. But speaking from a literary perspective, then, let me go back to something else that has been archetypal truism. And now, because our class is now talking about archetypes and Jungian archetypes and Campbell and those theorists, I used to teach in one of my classes the basic female archetypes of literature, which pervade through epics and epochs. You are either the virgin, good virgin, pure character, or you are the seductress character, or you are the mother or maternal character, or are you the old crone, the witch character. And that's pretty much it for female characters in literature. It's almost as if, and it's not hard to understand that males would want to categorize women in this way. But it's almost as if women don't get the chance to become, to demonstrate the psychologies that you're talking about. Let's do it that way. That women don't get the opportunity to voice and demonstrate in literature the psychologies that I think are important for men to hear.
Sure. I mean, I think that's the entire point of In a Different Voice, talking about the fact that women have always had more rich and robust things happening in their lives that just have been categorically ignored. And I think one concept that I hold on to very strong and archetypes are nice for giving you a very general, vague guideline of something that someone can represent, but it doesn't represent even, a fraction of the entirety of their complicated life.
Right.
And I think painting in those pieces where I can be a woman that is both the seductress and the mother and the old crone, depending on the situation, because all of those pieces can happen to me from a span of coffee to bedtime.
Okay.
It just really depends on the situation. But I think just thinking about the Bechdel test, if you're talking about a man versus talking about relationships, there's times, even in our own work, we talk about relationships, but I'm not talking about who I want to date or marry. I'm talking about how to get my boss to function better with my team. And so I think these relationship perspectives aren't a perpetual love story, but they are an insight in how to make things that are important in our lives function more smoothly.
Mm-hmm. And you're absolutely right, and I appreciate. We should probably direct the conversation to more contemporary applications, like you're talking about. I'm just thinking too, and I'll just dwell on this for one more moment. Why men might want to, males as authors might want to perpetuate these archetypal, also stereotypes, is because all 4 of those roles are women as defined by their functions for men. And, each of those. Cinderella is the beautiful virgin so that she can be that for the prince. The seductress is that because she can take our hero off the course if he falls to her. The mother figure, of course, is necessary, to nurture and to guide the goddess figure. And, of course, the old crone, the witch, is the evil woman that needs to be destroyed by the male. So each of these is a function of the male projection, psychological projection in literature. It's not that women exist in those archetypes at all, but that since 4,000 years of literature have perpetuated those 4 archetypes, they become extensions of the male psychology of women.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, if you really look at it, how long have women been able to be authors, to contribute to the dialogue, to leave the domestic sphere and have the ability to tell robust stories about themselves? And that's a very short period of time. Mm-hmm. And so those convenient stereotypes couldn't change, or convenient archetypal plot structures couldn't change until there was more input. And so that I'm excited about the ability for women to input more, with more female writers and more females trying to make it in Hollywood as producers and as film writers, as opposed to just acting out the script as written. So I think there's progress being made in those areas, but when we think back to the classics, for who?
Right. Let's talk about that for a moment. I like the way you said that. Classic for who? Which is yes. And one of the students was asking me earlier on that same note, isn't Carol Gilligan a feminist? And the answer is, well, yeah. I mean, it's not the badge that she wears as she goes charging out into the world, but it's hard to talk about feminine reality without being a feminist at some level. And I think that's, there's nothing militant about feminism. It's just this idea that, can we not forward this narrative and let it be genuine and real?
Sure.
And anyway, and so it was occurring to me. So in that case, if the female characters we see in literature are extensions of the male psychology, what's the counter? If we allowed women to be authors freely, which itself is problematic, and we could look at that as well. If we allowed women to be authors freely, what might they project onto male characters, or even differently, do you imagine, from male authors?
Well, I think that's a really intriguing question. And I think it would depend on the frame of reference and experience of the woman writing, because women are often very perceptive of the relationships that they have and what that means. I think power structures are certainly something that would be explored. Men are often found in power structures with very few women presidents, very few women CEOs, very few women, you name it. And so the dynamics of men in power over women in the workplace is huge, and how those dynamics evolve. And of course, then those archetypes come back, right?
Yep.
People think you're the woman who goes out to dinner with the boss, so what does that make you?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the one who's hungry when we have to have a meeting, right?
Right, yeah.
And I think in relationships too, there's times where men are great partners of women, and there's times where men are aggressors towards women. And I think there's definitely that dynamic that women talk about in the back of every woman's mind is this a safe space to exist?
Mm-hmm.
And I think talking about those types of dynamics in romantic relationships, in addition to outside of romantic relationships, is something that would have to be explored.
Mm-hmm. And of course, if we are consumers of the literature of a male psychology, male-oriented literature, if we're the consumers of that, if males are the consumer of this male-oriented literature, yes, then it's likely for them to categorize and simplify the relationships that they meet in the world. And it's no wonder that we have those miscues and those misunderstandings.
Absolutely. Well, the Margaret Atwood quote that men are always afraid that women will laugh at them and women are always afraid that men will kill them.
Yeah, I'm sorry to laugh at that. She's so good.
It's something that you think about. And over the summer, I don't know if you saw, there was an actual case where there was a couple that were on an Alaska cruise that cruised out of Vancouver up to Alaska and back. And the husband killed his wife because she was laughing at him and she wouldn't stop laughing, and he repeatedly told her to stop laughing, and she was in a giggle fit. It sounded like she might have been a little intoxicated, and he literally killed her and then threw her overboard.
Oh my God.
So I was actually on a flight with some people who'd been on the cruise, and they were telling me about this, and I was like, wow, so infrequently is a metaphor so aptly summed up in an actual event.
Yeah.
But as a woman who travels a lot, that is part of the dynamics, is that there's this safety element first. I think first and foremost on a lot of women's mind, and beyond that, there's a rich and diverse conversation to be had.
Oh, absolutely. Jeez, oh Pete, I'd not heard that. That's
Sorry, heavy, but
ironic and horrifying at the same time. Yeah. So, I'll go ahead then and take the nicer part of that example and say I love Margaret Atwood, and it's nice to see an author of her caliber starting to get some popular appeal, because when you talk about female authors reframing that narrative a little bit, Atwood is a master at it. She seems to really understand not only how to rethink and resist those patriarchal psychologies, but also to do it in a way where males can often nod their heads in understanding, as opposed to just being offended. And I don't know what it takes from her to do that, and I don't think she particularly cares too much, but she does seem to succeed at it. Most male fans that I know of Atwood admire her ability to somehow reorient their thinking in her writing. Her television and film work, maybe to a lesser degree, but certainly in her writing it does well.
Sure. Well, I think that almost exemplifies the idea of putting relationship first. We often talk about the need for courageous dialogue, that men are part of the solution to creating equality in equal measure to women, that we need to have these unifying concepts in places that we can all understand and walk forward from. More women need to tell stories in that way, because for every reference to feminazis and militantism, there's all these other women saying, I just want to be able to be an engineer and not have it be a female engineer. I just want to be an engineer. Why are you making it so difficult? And I think stories like Atwood that draw men into the conversation without ostracizing them is that focus on relationships that can push the cause forward.
Well, I would just, my thought is that no, you're absolutely wrong. Every time, every time, I know how it works. Every time women start talking about feminine issues, males' best strategy is just to go silent, isn't it? I mean, that's just the thing to do.
Ugh.
Right.
I will say I spent a significant portion of my time in the Middle East.
Okay. Yeah.
And I think some of the conversations there right now are fascinating. But you best believe it was men who made the final decision that women could drive in Saudi Arabia. There aren't women who were sitting on the committee saying, hey, do this for us, with the men sitting silently. A lot of the advances that are happening there, just like it happened in our culture long ago, might have feminine influence, but without men helping, never would have come to fruition.
Right.
And it's so interesting to see a modern place that has so far to go and watch it develop right in front of our eyes. It's something that I'm kind of excited about.
Have you ever had a chance to participate in any of these international discussions about women's rights and women's movements?
Absolutely. And there's some commonality among all of them, and there's some elements that are so culturally bound.
Yeah.
The first time I lived in the Gulf, there was a big conversation about how women aren't able to marry men outside of the country that they have citizenship in because their citizenship will be stripped. But men frequently date and marry foreigners. And so essentially it was creating this class of women who could never get an arranged marriage and ended up being an old maid. Which I don't love that term, but that was how they were phrasing it. And how they were so upset that men were circumventing this idea of arranged marriage that was their only option, that they were pushing for women to have the right to have mixers, like circa middle school mixers with parental supervision, so they could potentially meet men and entice them to marry them instead of the foreigners that many of them ended up with. That's not what feminism looks like in the States,
right?
But to them, it's a huge issue because it's very defining for them to have a spouse and to have children. And oftentimes women in so many other cultures say we don't want American feminism. We want feminism that works within the context of our faith and our culture. But we still need the things. There's a lot of things that need to happen in order for this to work. And one of my favorite books was around the fall of the Soviet Union, called How We Survived. Oh, wow, losing my mind. How We Survived Something and Even Laughed. And it was all about the lack of, I can look it up.
Yeah.
It was, survived communism and even laughed. That's right. And it's a great book about them asking all these Eastern European women, like, how does feminism work there? Tell us about your theories. And they were like, we ration everything we have and there's no tampons.
Yeah.
And, people, we've been squeezing berries out to make lipstick. And even when we had no toys, we took sticks and we made dolls and cars for our kids. And the women were just done with communism because we couldn't get enough toilet paper for our husbands so they could have a good bathroom experience before they went to work. And they basically said, you Western feminists with your head in the clouds, we just want some tampons. And it was so fair. Sometimes when we come from these very different planes of understanding without considering those cultural contexts, we miss the mark so thoroughly.
Yeah.
And that goes back to listening. I mean, we talk about those relationship pieces, but I've talked to women and said, how do you feel about arranged marriage? They say it's great, as long as we have X, Y, and Z elements to make it great for us. Cool. That sounds great. How do you feel about wearing hijab? Well, we love it as long as it's our choice to wear it, in those pieces. And so there's so many things that I think, even from the Western perspective, we just miss it. We say, people who veil are inherently oppressed. And you talk to my girlfriends in the Middle East, they're like, I haven't had to brush my hair in days.
Right, yeah. They're very happy. Yeah.
And so, outside of just women's issues, there are a lot of people in, especially Muslim countries, who say, we don't want democracy because by allowing us to vote, you're implying that we have more power than the God that chose our rulers. We want God's ruler. And they're they are being forced into democracy by well, not by us and by the entirety of the Western society, and they don't want freedom in the way that we imagine it.
Sure. No, I think you're absolutely right. If you look at a lot of political history, I find that what we push for often is what's the most convenient thing that could happen for Western democracy. It's not necessarily about the people we're quote unquote liberating. It's about what's going to work best for us. But I find if we can't respect those really important cultural elements in other cultures, we're not helping at all. In the Middle East, I think of India, there's a lot of places that have very deep-seated cultural pieces or religious pieces that are so important to them that if we want to steamroll them and say, get on the train with America that's largely post-religious society, we're not going to ever connect in a way that's meaningful.
Yeah. And it's, I don't know how, I mean, to some degree, not that, and Ethan also is in the Model UN team, so he understands that kind of international diplomatic approach. It sounds like it's almost the same thing. It's, in one sense, what men do in projecting their psychologies onto women, the United States does in the same sort of justice motif to project its democratic ideologies onto other countries in total. It's almost as if the paternal, and by that I mean both male-oriented now and father-protector-oriented role, which men bring onto women, the U.S. takes on internationally.
100%. That is a very good insight.
Oh, well, thank you. and it's funny though that it's hard to see that now, and I have another chapter of this discussion I want to take us to, but on that same note, I'm curious if I were to talk to a U.S. diplomat about this same topic, wouldn't they say, but we do know that the kind of democratic idealism that we foment, that we try to foster here in the United States, will bear fruit in other countries as well, when these oppressed peoples are given freedom of choice and that they're offered the same lifestyle, or rather level or quality of lifestyle, as we have. And we know that because country after country after country asks for our lifestyle.
I spend a lot of time with U.S. diplomats in real life.
Good.
And I find that they might have something to say in that regard. But more often when I meet with diplomats who spend their life living in these foreign cultures, they have a keener sense of awareness of what needs to happen for incremental baby steps.
Yeah.
So from DC, you might hear, this is what we want to see. But the truth is, little things, letting women drive, letting women work in malls that are women-only stores at women-only times. Those were big accomplishments that don't fit the bill of this sweeping, you should be Western. I do think that there's pieces of our culture that can benefit other cultures, especially women's economic empowerment, which we've seen a lot of microfinance initiatives come out of the States and kind of force other societies to recognize. But those same women are still praying 5 times a day. They're still drawing water from the wells. They're balancing the good things that they can take from us with the things that are great from their culture. And I always think of that Arabic proverb that says, with all things, eat the fruit and throw away the peels. And that's really what I think of when it comes to these pieces of we don't have it all. And the more I travel, the more I see there's so many good aspects that we could use in the U.S. And listening is one of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you raise a good point. I'm almost certainly thinking of our national politicians and how they frame it, because that's the narrative that we hear all the time.
And I always appreciate how carefully diplomats in real life have to dance around what Washington is saying loudly can do to serve when they're overseas. And I've met some great career diplomats who blood, sweat, and tears spend years trying to help and enrich a culture without beating them with the American stick.
Yeah, absolutely. There's another dimension of our discussion. Let's see if I can get my head back around it. Back to what we were talking about before. God darn it. It was there and I should have written it down. When we were talking about the literary... Oh, here it is. If I were going to take Gilligan's ideas and try to contort them in some way, could I argue that, well, if women are relationship oriented, isn't it right then that they should be in places where relationships are important, like in domestic scenes? And if men are principled and justice oriented, then isn't it right that they are in the workplace where those principles have power, especially in our economics? Could I take her arguments and turn them into a sexist policy?
I would argue that everywhere needs both. In the home, you need someone who cares about relationships, but you also need order. You don't want your kids to be the ones who end up on the news for doing illegal things, right? But in the same token, after working in several places, you don't want a workplace that doesn't care about people. Every business psychology course you'll take will tell you focusing on good management, cultivating leadership, and inspiring people to want to come to work and invest. All of that comes from relationships. They even say money is only a hygiene factor. It is basically pay me enough that I won't quit just because you're not paying me enough, but it's irrelevant to your desire to do your job. So if you have leaders who say, make me money, I don't care how, you're going to lose your whole staff and thereby lose your bottom line. And I think that exact argument should be used for why women need to be in more public spheres to help these types of issues.
And I don't disagree with... Go ahead, Ethan.
I think it's also important to note something we were talking about earlier, how the ideas that Gilligan was mostly talking about, she referred to them as female and male, but it might be better to talk about them as feminine and masculine instead. So just because if you were to take the stance that feminine ideals are better for the home, that doesn't mean that a man shouldn't be the one taking care of the kids and cooking.
Absolutely. And I'm very excited to see, especially in the big city life that I'm living now, more and more men do stay home. And more women are free to be the primary breadwinner. And I think that's the entire end goal of feminism, is to say just because you're a man doesn't mean you're the one who has to work obscene amounts of hours and stay away from the kids because we need money. It says, hey, you might be better at the relationship side, and I might be making money. Why don't we make a decision that makes sense for our own strengths and not for the societally expectations? So I think the more we progress with these ideas of equality and feminism, the more men will also benefit from getting some of the burden that's been placed on them taken off of their shoulders.
I'm reminded of, when you talk about the need for these things, I'm reminded of the history of the United Nations, where the diplomats organized in the UN back in the 40s needed to get rid of Eleanor Roosevelt. And they said, she's a pain in the ass. We need to move her someplace where she's not going to cause any trouble. Hey, wait, there's this new human rights committee. Let's put her over there, and she won't cause any trouble at all. And what came out of that was one of the most amazing human rights documents in the history of mankind, because of the work that she helped catalyze in that space. And I think that's a fair example of what happens when the men become dismissive, perhaps, of what women can contribute.
Absolutely. And the truth is, for centuries, for millennia, we don't know what lacking half of the human voice has caused us to lose.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know. I mean, women were home, they were raising kids, and that's a great societal contribution. Raising children is a great vocation in and of itself. But if those women had the choice to benefit society in other ways, we could have a lot of advancements that we'll never have the opportunity to know about at this point. And so removing some of those barriers now and seeing the contributions women make, I think that we see exciting synergies like Eleanor Roosevelt's trailblazing in the UN. So I'm interested to see the more people talk about the glass ceiling all the time, but the ceiling isn't just the problem. It's the ability to operate fully in those spaces and fully contribute in ways that will help everyone.
Right. Most women are not in a position or in a place where the ceiling matters to them. And then, go ahead, but.
You're absolutely right. I was going to say more women are in the space where they say something in the boardroom, and then a man picks it up and says it, and then it's attributed to what he said. And that's if they don't just talk over her entirely. Mm-hmm. So now she has the right to sit there, but does she have the right to fully contribute and be seen as an equal member of the team? There's still more work to be done.
Yeah. Let me take that question and play it back in a different direction. You're right that women have this ability to contribute, that women have the skill to contribute, but then sometimes attributed to or stolen by the male voice. In a different case, let's see if I can get my head around this idea. Is it also true that women who are students of a male-centered literature, to go back to an earlier part of the conversation, if women are part of a male-centered literature where they also learn only this particular narrative, does that in any way psychologically restrict their voice? Do you understand what I'm asking?
Absolutely. I think depending on where women study, the voices that contribute to a woman's understanding definitely can limit their vocabulary and their understanding of their own experience. If we were all in the 70s learning about morality, every psychology student who's female is looking at it saying, I'm deficient. The scale is saying that I'm immoral.
Right.
And we didn't have the scale or the framework to say, hey, I'm actually doing a great job if they consider me on the scale that's being used. So I think there's a responsibility of teachers, of authors, of theorists to give us the language and the lens to give us the perspective of our lives. But I always say there's multiple inputs. So if at school you only read these certain things, but you go home and you're reading feminist literature, or you talk to your parents about their experience as soldiers, or you go home and, there's so many different things that come together to combine someone's worldview. And so hopefully one really great teacher could make the difference, like you, or one really bad teacher isn't going to destroy someone forever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, could you talk a little more about that morality idea? This we didn't talk about Kohlberg at all this year, and I'm not sure if that's who you're indexing there, or do you have someone else in mind when you say that back in the 70s women were ranked?
I was thinking more if you were looking at what's happening with in a different voice when you talk about women and their ability to prioritize relationships and perhaps make decisions that are more relationally based than justice based. If you use that from a morality perspective. But no, Kohlberg is also a whole different theoretical animal that we could talk about.
To which Gilligan also responded. Yeah, but I'm sorry to interrupt.
Oh no, you're fine. But one thing that I think is great is the further we progress, the more theoretical options you have that can be combined for fuller understanding. Other theories that I'm really interested in is theories of being multicultural in a primarily white society, theories of coming out as gay in a primarily, well, most societies are primarily heterosexual, and these stages of not knowing who you are and coming to an awareness that you might be different, being terrified about it, to going to a stage where you are out loud and proud and want everyone to know it, to perhaps moving on to a stage where it's integrated as much space and mental energy. So I think there's multiple different pieces that we can add on to all of these theories that give a fuller picture of the rich life that we have. And I apologize, I'm starting to get some email pop-ups over here that I'm trying to get rid of while we chat.
That's okay, we can't tell. But I appreciate you bringing this up as a parallel to LGBT issues, to ethnic and race issues. We're wrestling with Ellison right now. We're finishing up Invisible Man, but I think the questions of other minority groups and feminists in particular are going to come up in the spring for us. But this is a good foundational framing to suggest that, wait a second, are the great virtuous works that we're reading at any level limiting in how we envision our human potential? And I think if all we do is read male writers, if all we do is read the male concept of virtues and the male characterization of women, then what do we run into except a self-doubt in women readers?
No, I think that's absolutely true. And what might be joyful or terrifying for your students is that means if you really want to understand these issues, you need to commit to reading for the rest of your life. You need to commit to listening to other perspectives for the rest of your life. And I think we're in an amazing time where there's great articles from around the world, there's great YouTube snippets, there's great different ways that you can access these different perspectives. But you have to commit to really listening and looking for those different perspectives to get that full picture of what humanity really is.
Absolutely.
You mentioned earlier something about standing out, in particular with what I noticed was you were talking about coming out in a society that is primarily heterosexual. And it made me think of my experience in drama club. Because of that, most of my friends are in some way not heterosexual. And it made me think for a time that I wasn't either. And for a while I thought that I was bi, and as time progresses I'm realizing more and more that no, I'm straight.
Yeah.
And it almost feels weird to me to be straight surrounded by people who, even if they are heterosexual, don't act straight all the time. It is who I am, and it's been a little bit difficult to come to grips with the fact that that's okay too.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. And I think that's a very adult experience that you're going through, is in the very same way as that theory says. You're realizing you're different from those around you. You have to examine it and see if it's true or not. And then you have to come to a place of acceptance. And I think one of the things that we lack in society a lot is to say, I'm different and I accept that about myself. But it's also okay to accept those who are different from me and the choices that they make in their lives. Yeah. And I think some of the most disappointing encounters I've seen in my life come with people who go through that process and decide at the end, therefore everyone who's different from me is wrong or bad or what have you, rather than being comfortable living in your own space, in your own experience, and being comfortable with yourself and those who come to different realities. So it sounds like you're actually going to a really great place of being in a mature space at such a young age. That's great.
Yeah. I would tend to agree, and I think it's fascinating, too, from a different angle on that, it's interesting that a culture, however small that culture, can, I won't say easily, but can certainly push people to begin to change or question their own identities. Any culture can do that, and it can cause some uncertainty. So you can imagine if your entire life and existence is part of a larger culture, or a history of generations of that culture, which has challenged our identities in a particular way. And I'm referencing, of course, now, and Ethan probably sees this, racial identity in terms of African Americans and through Ralph Ellison. If you've got a character who is trying to understand who he is, but he's grown up in a white culture that is powered by 400 years or more of a slave history and a history of oppression, I think that can cause you an identity crisis.
Absolutely. But the best thing about crises is you get past them. Hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully.
We're not psychologically damaged in some way. They're able to experience it, hold it in their hands, feel the discomfort, consider those options and feel those emotions, and then move past it is the ideal. And I think that's a great experience to have, because then you know that you know. Right. You're not heterosexual because that's what your parents told you you were, or you think so. You've gone through it, you've considered the options, you've had the feelings, and you've made a decision. So now you're really firmly rooted in the ability to accept yourself for who you are. Absolutely. That's awesome.
Yeah. And we're moving in on 8 o'clock, and what I want to do is ask you, in light of these things that we've been talking about, which I think is interesting because it's very different from what we talked about last time when we did this. In light of things we've been talking about, and if I were a female reader, but a male too, but if I were a female reader and wanted to find out more about how women writers might reorient or rethink about the world, can you think of any titles of fiction or nonfiction or poetry or anything else that have stood out for you that might be worth investigating more?
Wow.
I know.
So many. Yes. That's such a big question. I might have to email you a list later after I think about that.
Oh, that would be great too. But I thought of Lynn Heinemann, Marguerite Duras, Hélène Cixous. Those are ones that stand out to me, who have made open attempts to reconfigure prose text. But beyond that, I don't know where I would start.
Yeah, I think of some of my favorite authors as being wonderful feminist authors, but not necessarily laying the framework from a theoretical perspective.
Yeah.
I know I've told you before, I love Lisa C. as an author.
Oh, yeah.
She's a Chinese-American, fifth generation, but she writes these wonderfully rich stories about women throughout different periods of U.S. history and Chinese history from a women's voice. And I also like that it adds that multicultural perspective of, we came here from China, and this was our experience being isolated as culturally stereotyped Chinese women in this particular context, and you really hear a voice that's different from the stories that you might have read male authors writing about Chinese women at the time.
Right.
Those types of stories I love, and I have probably a whole bookshelf full of similar ones. So perhaps we can collaborate on a list that your students could access.
Yeah. I'm thinking of Chimamanda Adichie as well.
Such a great writer.
Oh, and speaker. What a great speaker she is. Yeah, but her novels and her nonfiction, her more recent nonfiction, is exemplary that way. But yeah, there's an enormous list. I was just curious if any jumped out at you as being essential, and for even your own personal view, what one or two that might have kind of really hit you and altered your thinking in ways?
Let me get back to you on that.
That's fine.
I know with my lack of caffeine right now, I will forget someone important. But in general, I get to spend a lot of time on planes and trains and buses where there's dead time, and I read a lot, just a lot.
Yeah.
And my best suggestion to students is don't just read these, this is canon, this is the best thing. Read everything voraciously. Because the more you read, something will strike you as an important voice.
Absolutely. Very good. Let's see. Well, we're running out of time. Ethan, while we've got her, is there anything hanging out in your head that we really want to address?
There was one thing. I've heard one definition of theme in literature, that theme is what stays the same when you change all of the nouns.
Ah, interesting.
So I was wondering how you think it might change any given work of literature if every character, or even just the main character, not be that gender or not be that race.
Oof.
Yeah.
Wow. What a question. Well, I think as Steve alluded to, there's so much riding on our histories. There's so much riding on our gender. There's so much riding on the racial histories that we carry with us, or the stories from our families, that you can switch those nouns, but it would significantly impact the story. And I think in my own work, helping at a rape crisis shelter, the story of I was raped from a woman came with different trauma than a man coming in with the exact same similar story. And so I think that just switching things really dishonors the spirit of the background and the context that come from. They come from. Clearly the English is going well for me today.
That's all right. But that's helpful too, and I'm thinking of it's God darn it, yeah, we're starting to connect. I'm looking up something right now as well, and of course one of the things that occurs to me is Ursula Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness, which was one of our summer reads. I don't think that's one that Ethan looked at. Ethan read 2 or 3 of our summer reads, but I don't think that was one of them, where the pronouns of the characters literally shift back and forth, and because their genders do. In the case, the gender is truly physically fluid for these people, and as a consequence, as a hetero, not even hetero, but as a gender static reader, you go in with an expectation that this pronoun is being attached to this character. Therefore, I think this way about that character. And then that pronoun flips. And then as a reader, you have to kind of say, wait a minute.
What happened?
Yeah, now I have to rethink who that was. And, it's an interesting storyline for a character, a gender static character, to go in and try to encounter these people. But I think it's even more fascinating for us as readers to try to get our head around what just happened to my reading experience, even though that character is the exact same person they were 20 pages ago. But now I'm
back to something we learned recently in AP World, that in the Quran, the not just pronouns but the verb forms and adjective forms surrounding God change throughout the Quran, and part of that is because unlike the Judeo-Christian belief that God is a man, the Muslim God just doesn't have a gender.
right.
But also it's part of the one of the central beliefs of the earlier sects of Islam, that you can't represent God or Muhammad or any of God's creations. And one of the things preventing you from representing God is you don't know what they look like or what they are at all.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I think when you think about it that way, gender labels are, in that sense, more a question of politics and ideology than they are of reality.
Absolutely. But I think building on those politics creates social structures and behaviors towards one gender or other genders that can create a lived experience. And so I think in some ways the limiting factors come from social expectations and not from gender itself.
Yeah, absolutely. So on that note, I think what we're going to do is I'm going to, in just a second, pause our recording part, then we can sign off. But Lisa Maroni, thank you very much for coming all the way from Seattle.
Absolutely.
And that's amazing. I'll come out and we'll hunt Bigfoot together one day. And because I'm counting on doing that at some point in my life, so might as well be with you. Get your mucklucks on; it'll be fun. But thank you for joining us. This was a lot of fun tonight. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Okay.